Now, you might be wondering why the sidebar is staying the same. And that's because, again, it's taking up only the space that it requires here. So it takes up as much space as to fill that longest word sidebar. If you want to explicitly state a width, you could say width 30%. 70 plus 30 equals 100. Now, if I refresh, you'll see that that's taken up 30% of the entire width. If you want to adjust this, you could say 90 for content and 10 for the sidebar. And now we have a much more flexible content area, but now we have a new problem. It's fine here, but as soon as I scroll all the way down, you'll see that the width of our sidebar is too small, because at this point, 10% of a width of around 400 pixels is very little, only 40 pixels. So what if we wanted to set some minimums? And why don't we try that? We have a width of 80%, and we'll set minimum width to around 600 pixels. And while we don't have to, it's easier for me to read if I first we're going to have a minimum of 600, but then the width can be as much beyond that as it needs to in order to be 80%. But it can't go lower than 600 pixels. Now if I refresh, it seems the same for the big window, but now watch what happens when I reduce it. It's going to get to a point right here. It's not going to get any more narrow. And we can do the exact same thing for our sidebar. So if we want to set 20, 80, refresh, that looks good. And we want to make sure that no matter what, the width is appropriate. Good, so now you have a more flexible website. People browsing in lower resolutions can access your site, and then for larger resolutions, you can provide a different set of options. Maybe you want to display more at the top. You can do a lot of stuff here. Now we need to go over one more thing for today. Watch what happens when I apply a background color to our wrapping div right here. Background equals green. What do you think is going to happen? Refresh, and isn't this odd? The background color for our entire wrapping element seems to only be taking up the heading element. And why is that? And the only reason is, watch what happens when we remove the floats. Refresh, now it is taking up all of the available space. So it seems that when we apply floats, it takes these elements out of the flow of the document. Now this is only partially true, but for where you are, it makes sense. When you float an element, you're saying, I no longer want you to have a block display where you're going to take up as much space as you can. I'm going to rip you out of the flow of the document. And when it does that, the background color for the wrapper assumes that there's nothing below it. So this is a problem, and this is something that gets people tripped up quite a bit. There's lots of ways to fix this. One of them, and the most traditional way, is to use a CSS property called clear. So let's imagine right here we had a footer, and this is a new element for you. It designates the footer of a particular section, whether it's a blog posting or a website. And I'm going to say my footer. Now if I refresh, notice how it seems to trigger the wrapper. And the only reason it's doing this is because both of these elements, this one and this one, are floated. So they're out of the flow of the document. But our footer is not. So that triggers the wrapper to contain it. It's a way of clearing it. Footer, and we're going to clear anything that occurs above it. So if there's any floated elements, this is going to clear it. Now if we refresh, you're going to see the same thing. But if you ever find yourself in a situation where it seems like an element is way up here into a different section and it shouldn't, make sure that you're clearing it so it clears any floats that are above it. Now another way that we could potentially solve this, if we had no footer, if we come back, we're still with this problem, is by using a trick called overflow hidden. Overflow, set that to hidden. And I don't expect you to understand why this works. For now, just accept that it's a way to trigger the browser into containing the elements within whatever you're specifying here. So just accept that is a little trick to make sure that it contains it. So good job. We've covered a lot in this lesson. If you need to go back and watch it again, do so, because these techniques are going to be vital in your web design career.